with this God of the Israelites, that there is a pillar of fire that leads them, a pillar of cloud that leads them. That there is manna that's provided. And of course, if anyone contests Moses' authority, the ground opens up and swallows them alive. Pretty convincing. So if you're wondering, well, did God really tell Moses to command the driving out of the Canaanites? Well, look at his credentials. Look at the public signs. If you have any doubt, this doubting Israelite saying, I don't know, Moses is telling me this stuff. Korah and 250 of his rebels got just swallowed up. Okay, I think I'll follow Moses here. Even if I have questions, this is reinforced by remarkable signs and wonders. Okay, I'm persuaded. Again, people say, God told me to do this. Okay, what are your credentials? What are your prophetic credentials looking like? What are the public signs that accompany your sorts of allegations that God spoke to you and told you to do something outrageous? If you think what God is telling Moses to do is outrageous, well, look at the signs and wonders. You'll see that maybe there's a little bit more we ought to consider here. Another thing that we often lose sight of, and the new atheists like Richard Dawkins are very good at pointing out, but again, failing to look at the context. The poor Canaanites being driven out and so forth, or Christopher Hitchens, the same sort of thing. Those poor Canaanites being driven out, and well, were they really poor Canaanites? Let's try to understand their culture a little bit better. What sorts of things were they engaging in? Were they just people minding their own business, not bothering anyone? Or are they actually engaged in some things that are pretty terrible? Well, yes, the latter. They are engaged in ritualized adultery, prostitution, where you engage in sexual relations with a temple prostitute, and this is part of the religious ritual so that you can have crops that are fertile, that you can have children and so forth. All of this that is part of the theology of the Canaanites. And after all, the Canaanite gods and goddesses do this sort of thing. They engage in all sorts of sexual encounters and so forth. Why can't the people of Canaan do that? They're just following their deities. What about incest? Well, the Canaanite people do it. Why? Well, their deities are doing it. Not surprising. The apple doesn't fall far from the theological tree. We see that there is also bestiality. We see that there is, of course, destruction of children through the burning of these children. What the Bible calls they're passing through the fire. Burning of children on these molten bowls underneath the fire, and they're just scalded to death. These are the sorts of things that would be punishable in any civilized country. These are the sorts of things that would be criminally prosecutable in any civilized country. So it's not as though they just have an alternative lifestyle. We don't have tattoos in Israel, but those people have tattoos over there. Well, there's a lot more going on than just some mild variation. We don't eat non-kosher foods. They eat shrimp and lobster and so forth. No, there's something much more substantial than this. And a lot of times the way it's presented is that these people are just innocent, minding their own business. Now, I'm not saying that they were the worst specimens of humanity that ever existed, no, but sufficiently degraded and also worthy of punishment, and also which we'll talk about the coming in to the land in just a moment, the promise that God had given them. But let me just offer a little bit of a philosophical discussion here. It is helpful for us as we look at the command regarding the Canaanites to make three important distinctions, and this is discussed in the philosophical literature, but I think it's helpful for us to ponder here. That there are the three differentiations that I want to make are general duties, there are absolute duties, and that there are overridden duties or general duties in the case of a supreme emergency. So the first is, let's just tackle the general duties that we have. Sometimes called prima facie duties, where we don't deceive, where we don't take innocent life. These are general duties, but again, that's different from absolute duties. For example, there's an absolute duty to that should never be violated, that can never be violated. For example, to love God. There is again unqualified absolute duty to love God. an unqualified duty not to engage in idolatry. But in cases of supreme emergency, some of the general or prima facie duties that we have, that there may be overriding circumstances in which we take a higher level of consideration in light of this supreme emergency. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, the famous question: if you're hiding Jews in your basement, do you deceive the authorities? Well, yes, you do, to save innocent human life from destruction. We see this carried out even in the scriptures. We see the Hebrew midwives who are protecting innocent newborns, newborn males, and deceiving Pharaoh about their status. We also see Rahab doing this in Joshua chapter 2, of deceiving the authorities, sending the spies off in a different direction. We see God doing this in 1 Samuel 16, where Samuel is told to anoint a new king, and he says, well, if Saul hears about this, he's going to kill me. And so God says, well, if anybody asks you why you're going to Bethlehem, just say that you're going to offer a sacrifice there. And what's the real reason he's going? He's going to anoint a new king. But this is his foil. God himself is commanding this. And God does engage in deceptive activity. For example, when the Israelites are fighting, he helps set an ambush for the enemies of Israel in order to help the Israelites to overcome them. So deception is permissible when it comes to warfare, when it comes to criminal activity. And we could also add when it comes to light social deception, like you're playing soccer and you fake out your opponents. Hey, you're not allowed to do that. That's deception. No, we understand that that's part of the game. You try to fake out your opponents. But again, nothing immoral there. In fact, Jesus himself on the road to Emmaus, he motioned that he would want to go farther, and that he didn't want to impose himself on hosts in Emmaus. So he said that he was going to go on, and they said, "No, remain with us, O Lord. It's now the evening; the day is past and over." And so you have even this, that just be out of politeness. There's kind of a, well, I'm just going to go on, even though he does want to come to join the disciples there. So there can be overriding circumstances when it comes to not the general standard of not deceiving. Generally speaking, you tell the truth. Generally speaking, and here's the question: you don't take innocent human life. Now, some people say, no, that's an absolute rule. Well, actually, think about it. Maybe there are circumstances in which taking innocent human life, though not desirable, may need to be done for certain overriding reasons. So you have an ectopic pregnancy, for example, that a woman who has an ectopic pregnancy, where of course the fertilized egg does not implant in the uterus but is trapped in the fallopian tube. Well, if this situation continues, then both the unborn as well as the woman will die. So in order to protect at least one life, this needs to be done, as tragic as that is. When there is a terrorist attack and a plane is hijacked by a terrorist and is seeking to use that plane as a weapon, so a president or a prime minister would be justified in calling the Navy to shoot the plane out of the sky, even though it may mean killing innocent men, women, and children on board. Now, is it a tragedy? Yes, it is. But what is the overriding consideration here? That is the slaughter of many more human beings. And so the attempt to preempt that would be morally justified. So it is not an absolute rule that one can never justifiably take innocent human life, but it have to be one of these cases of supreme emergency or overriding circumstances. Well, could it not be the case that God, in commanding the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites, that if there is the loss of innocent life, that this would be morally justified for reasons that God himself has, is aware of, even though we may not know what the full reasoning is. So rather than saying, oh, if God, if a good God exists, he could never command the killing of the Canaanites or driving out of the Canaanites, maybe say if God clearly does command the driving out of the Canaanites or even the killing of the Canaanites, then he would have a morally sufficient reason for doing so. So rather than looking at it from one angle, we ought to flip it. And we say, well, no, if a good God is clearly commanding this, then he would have a good reason for doing so. Well, some people will say, what about those terrorists today who claim that God told them to blow up a bus full of children? And go into more detail on this in the book, but in the notes I mentioned a few things here that we should consider. First of all, just because people believe that God has told them somehow that he wants this, this doesn't mean that God actually has commanded this. In fact, Jesus himself says a lot of people will do all sorts of things in the name of God. Right. They'll even persecute you and put you to death in the name of God, thinking that they're doing a service for God. But of course, clearly misguided, clearly in error here. Also, an act would be obligatory only if God actually commanded it. And so it's not obligatory if one imagines that God commanded it. It's not justified if one imagines that God commanded this. And so it would be right only if, and we need to remember this too. We're talking about a God who is good, wise, rational, just, and so forth. That if a good, wise, and just God commands something, again, we ought to do it. But is this blowing up a bus of children what a good, wise God would command? God may have certain overriding circumstances for certain things that we talk about in Scripture. But we need to consider that there is, did God actually command this? And we can also add this, that is this command surrounded by the kinds of signs and wonders that we see going on in the land of Egypt and in the promised land that God has taken the Israelites to? We see that there is this reinforcement, this divine stamp of approval that God has approved of Moses as his spokesman and so forth. Anyway, we can go into more detail here, but in the interest of time, let me keep going. There's also another consideration here, and a lot of times people like Richard Dawkins will use this criticism of, look at the Israelites, here they are just in worshiping the golden calf, and God just gets so angry with them, and he's just so jealous and capricious, and this just seems so out of proportion. Well, when you look at what God is actually doing, when you look at how God is calling a people for himself, making a covenant with them to be a blessing to the nations, that there are certain stipulations that God has for them that, if violated, would utterly undermine the identity and the mission of this people in the world. So when they are worshiping the golden calf, when they are in Numbers 25 engaging in idolatry and adultery with the Midianites as part of a subversive plot that Balaam came up with, that this is tantamount to treason. That this kind of activity utterly undermines the covenant that God has made with the people of Israel. That the very reason that God has called them into existence to be a blessing to the nation is now being jeopardized. It's now being compromised. And God is justifiably angered by this. Another thing to keep in mind as we look at the driving out of the Canaanites is that this is the moral degradation of the Canaanites is at a maximum capacity, so to speak. That God tells Abraham himself in Genesis 15:16 that he's going to wait for the sin of the Amorites to be filled up or to be completed. So we're talking about well over 400 years that God is saying he's going to wait. God is being patient. He's waiting until this time is filled up. God is not going to command the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites until the timing is right, until they have reached their moral low point. So Israel has a right to the land, but only under the circumstance where God can now drive out the Canaanites before them. Not before this. They would not have been justified in driving them out before. When you look at Abraham and his engagement with the Canaanite peoples, there is a kind of a friendly engagement that Abraham does some things wrong, but there is a general goodwill that we see in the earlier portions of the Bible in Genesis, where there is good engagement with the Canaanite peoples overall, that they have not reached that moral low point that God is anticipating. Now, God himself tells the Israelites that if they do the sorts of things that the Canaanites will do, that he will also drive them out, that they will be spewed out of the land. Indeed, they were. when they were mimicking what the Canaanites were doing, in 722 BC, the Assyrians come in and bring divine judgment by God's hand onto the Israelites because of their disobedience, because of their idolatry. We see this happen with Judah in the southern kingdom, that in 586, 587 BC, the Babylonians come in and bring destruction. So they are being vomited out as well. So it's, a lot of people say, well, God is just favoring the Israelites. God is saying, no, the same sort of things that the Canaanites have done, if you do them, the same consequence is going to come to you. God is speaking with great justice here. As we read in other portions of the Old Testament as well, another part of the preliminaries is that God does have an overarching concern for the Canaanite peoples. That, of course, God welcomes Canaanites into the land, into the people of Israel, that if they're willing to turn from their ways and join with the Israelites, that they become part of the people of God. And we've already seen Rahab and the Shechemites, and to some extent the Gibeonites, who join up with the Israelites, even though by deceptive means. So we see, in the scriptures, in the Psalms, in Zechariah and so forth, that God is concerned about bringing reconciliation and incorporating the peoples who are the enemies of Israel, including the Philistines, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of these public enemy number one sorts of people in Israel. God is working toward the redemption of these people, and he includes the Jebusites in here, the people who are the Canaanite inhabitants near Jerusalem. They were also part of this broader picture of salvation that God had in mind, that these would be incorporated into his people. So it's not as though there is some sort of ethnic animosity or ethnic favoritism. In fact, if you put a Canaanite and an Israelite next to each other, they would look the same, they would speak the same language, they would dress the same, and you couldn't tell them apart. So it's not as though there is something intrinsically distinctive about the Israelites. But there is a remarkable, not only similarity, but there's also a concern that God has for their ultimate salvation, even if now they're living morally degraded lives. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, if you read that text, it's interesting that it says, utterly destroy them, leave alive nothing that breathes, and so forth. And then it goes on to say, make no treaties with them. Do not intermarry with them. But I thought they were just supposed to be wiped out. And then it goes on to say, no, don't intermarry with them, etc. But it does go on to say, destroy their religious paraphernalia, destroy their idols, their altars, and so forth. That you are to destroy all of those things that have the mark of this false, morally degraded religion. So God seems more interested in destroying Canaanite religion than he is in destroying Canaanites. And we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 through 6. And you can look at that text yourselves. And then there is another consideration here. That a lot of people, when they use the language of genocide, it actually is not even in keeping with how we use that language today. For example, in the trials in the concerning atrocities in the former Yugoslavia, we see that there is a remarkable, of course, justifiable trials for these atrocities. But the term genocide was used, or was basically set aside in many of the cases because it just wasn't clear that this indeed was what was the purpose, the total destruction of the whole or most of the people group aimed at their physical disappearance from the earth. This doesn't seem to be the concern that God has in issuing this command. It does not fit in with even the modern day definitions of genocide. And again, in the book, we go into a lot more detail on some of these modern day human rights trials, these crimes against humanity trials with people from the former Yugoslavia involved. So again, would encourage you to take a look at that. But again, even according to the modern day definitions, it doesn't fit with what the scriptures are saying. Now, let me move on to discuss some of the texts that we have before us. And again, I'll mention some of these just in general, assuming that you have an idea of what these texts are about. But I want to explore some of the now biblical material related to these, the Amalekites and the Midianites and so forth. So let's look at some of these warfare texts in Scripture and try to put them into proper context. The predominant command that we see in the Pentateuch related to the Canaanites is that of driving out or dispossessing them. Remember that God has promised a land to Abraham, but it cannot come to his descendants until the people are sufficiently corrupted that they could be driven out. And so we see the majority of commands being to drive them out, to dispossess them, to remove them. And the language of dispossession or removal or driving out is not the language of killing or literally destroying them. So for example, this term is used when Adam and Eve are driven out of the Garden of Eden. This is the language that is used when we see David driven out from the presence of Saul. This is the language that we see of people who are removed from one location, pushed out, but again, they are still alive once they've been pushed out. So again, if you're driving them out, they aren't being killed. And this is the dominant language that is being used. Now, also, what's interesting here is there's kind of like a triad. If you think of a pyramid or a triangle, where you have at the top the deity in the land of Canaan, the ancient Near Eastern deity, and then at the bottom you have the people and the religion, or sorry, the people and the land. So you have this triad of the deity, the people, and the land. If you drive out the people from the land, this is actually a way of showing the superiority of the people who are driving them out over the local deities here, because there is a close connection to the land, to productivity and so forth. The people identify with this chunk of real estate as part of their God-given right or something. Their deity is over this portion of land. Well, to drive them out means a destabilizing of their own religion, and even rethinking, how could our God allow this to happen? This is his land. How can we be removed from it? What's even more interesting is that you have God, the one true God of the Israelites, actually engaging this kind of activity in the land of Egypt, kind of creating a destabilization of the theology of the Egyptians, because here routinely God is just one after the other attacking and undermining the deities of the Egyptians. So he's doing it in another land that he's going to take the Israelites out of, but yet there is this kind of destabilizing factor that is part of the equation. So we see that there is this language of driving out, and we need to see this in a kind of twofold manner. That there is first of all, the command to drive out is the first phase, if you will. That God commands them to be driven out. In fact, in Exodus 23, the very first time that we see this mentioned, God said he's going to drive out the Canaanites. Like hornets are going to drive them out. This is how God is wanting to work, to drive out the people. And then the people, as they show their stubbornness, as they show their rebellion and so forth, the process gets slowed down. And then there is also warfare that is attached to it that they're going to be engaging in. But it is a two-phase operation of driving them out, and those who remain behind leave themselves vulnerable to attack. So driving them out, and if people remain behind, then they are vulnerable to the attack of the Israelites. And of course, typically what happens is that you do have the more vulnerable, the non-combatants that flee, typically, the women, the children, the elderly, and so forth. This is what is, how things typically operate in the ancient Near East. But if they stick around, then they become vulnerable to attack. A second point that is made, and in this, as we look at the texts, that often raises eyebrows, and what we want to do is unpack this a little bit, is to note the hyperbolic language that is being used in not only Joshua and Deuteronomy, but also in the ancient Near Eastern war texts overall. That we see a high degree of hyperbolic language that is used. And if you read this in the ancient Near Eastern context, you would not think, oh, there literally was not one survivor left. You would think of it more in terms of, it's in a lighter sense, but like a basketball team saying, oh, we totally slaughtered our opponents. We annihilated them. No one takes that language at face value. And in the same way, in these war texts, you wouldn't take that language at face value. That we utterly destroyed them, we left alive none that breathes, there were no survivors. No, you have a very hyperbolic language here. And in fact, as we look at the ancient Near East, in fact, you can read about this in Kenneth Kitchen's book on the reliability of the Old Testament, in which he looks at these texts and he highlights how this was standard fare in the ancient Near East, where you could have a narrow margin of victory and you could say, we utterly destroyed them. You could, like even King Mesha, who is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, as the king of Moab, we have an inscription from him saying that Israel is no more. It's kind of humorous when you think about it. I mean, who's heard of Moab these days, But here you have Israel is no more. He's saying this. Well, we obviously know that Israel hung around. As we see other inscriptions, I turned them to ash. Again, sounds like utter annihilation, utter destruction, but in actual fact, you don't have, anything resembling, utter annihilation or destruction. Indeed, we see this sort of a thing in the text itself of the Scriptures. As we look at the Scriptures, we see this. In fact, as we look at not only Joshua, but as we look at Judges, we see, as we set these texts side by side, that there is more like a gradual infiltration rather than this dramatic military blitzkrieg that takes place. It is something that takes place, and from an archaeological point of view, the evidence shows that it takes a couple of hundred years before this transition shifts, is made from these Canaanite deities to Yahweh being the national deity in that land. It takes a long period of time before the transition is actually made. And this is indeed what the book of Judges reminds us of. Again, you see repeatedly, they could not drive them out. 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 But doesn't Joshua say that we utterly destroyed them, that the land found rest on all sides? Well, Joshua does say this. This is the kind of the war text, kind of classic war text that fits in with the ancient Near Eastern genre. But even Joshua himself will say at the end in chapter 23 that there are many nations that still need to be driven out of the land. But I thought the land had rest on every side. And then at the end Joshua is saying this. What's going on? Well, if you understand that this is ancient Near Eastern hyperbole or exaggeration, it fits very nicely with it fits the facts. Just in case you're wondering, let's take a look at these passages here, where we see on the one hand language of extermination, totally destroyed them, etc., and then we see those same people who are allegedly utterly destroyed back in action, it seems. So wherever you seem to see utter destruction, you also see those people reappearing as though there hasn't been this total slaughter that allegedly took place. So we see that Joshua 10, sometimes in the same verse or same chapter or a couple of chapters later, we see that those people who have been exterminated or have not been exterminated. So Joshua 10, Joshua and the Israelites had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed. And the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities. It's the same verse, my friends. They're destroyed. But then the survivors went to be... So what's going on here? Well, if you understand that hyperbole, it fits very well. In the land, the town of Devere, Joshua 10:39, all utterly destroyed. And then it says later on in chapter 11 that Joshua utterly destroyed the Amalekites in Devere. But I thought that already took place. Well, there's more going on here if you understand that hyperbole, that exaggeration. The Amalekites in Hebron were cut off, utterly destroyed. There were no Anakim left in the land. And then Caleb drives out the Anakim in Hebron, just a little bit later. So again, I can add more. I've given you more in this chart to go through, but this is the sort of thing we see repeatedly. So it does fit in very well with the literary genre of war texts, that there is utter destruction mentioned, total annihilation, and then lots of survivors. Now this, as we look at the archaeological picture, as we look at even the biblical picture as as it's played out in the book of Joshua, we see that even the battles in these cities of Canaan are not, like I said, total military blitzkriegs where everything is utterly destroyed. We actually see these what are more like military raids, disabling raids, as Kenneth Kitchen calls them, where you have these cities being attacked, and again, these cities are not where you have civilians. You might have an occasional innkeeper like in Jericho, who's a female, but typically this is where the political and military and religious leaders are. It's where grain is stored, the taxes and so forth. It was guarding these granaries, these storage places, But as the Israelites go into these cities, they disable them, and then they go back to their base camp. So it's not as though they're just taking over one city after another. They're raiding, disabling, and coming back to their base camp at Gilgal. So this is, again, it's interesting to note that as you look more closely at the text. Again, not glossing over the text, but actually digging into the text more carefully. You start to see a more subtle picture developing. You start to see layers. You start to see some nuance here. And so I had a debate with Norman Backrack. You can listen to it on either on YouTube or you go to my website. But he is the leader. He's the leader of the Humanist Association of London, and he was saying, well, look, how much plainer can the text be when it says they utterly destroyed them? They utterly destroyed them, left no survivor. I said, well, you're only reading one side of the ledger. What about the other texts that say there are lots of survivors? What I'm trying to do is get you to look at both sides. Rather than just kind of stacking them up on one side and saying, oh, look at how terrible all of this is. Look at this slaughter. And when you fail to consider the many survivors that are there, that this is speaking using hyperbolic language, what I'm trying to do is get you to remove that distorted language and actually look at the more realistic picture here when you see these two things held in tension. If you take both of them literally, they would contradict each other. And so in the same way, we need to look at the text in all of its facets to try to see what is it saying. Now let me say something about the Midianites. Again, the language that is used of them is utterly destroy them and so forth. So we see in Numbers 25, I mentioned this, the Midianites seduced the Israelites, which I said is tantamount to treason, that God commands retribution. And here's what God commands. In 31:7 of Numbers, it says, Israel fought against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every man. So as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed every man. Now, they did what they were called to do. They fulfilled this task. Now, Moses, however, actually, it seems, goes beyond this. Even though they had the Israelites had done what they were commanded to do, Moses says, weren't the women involved too? You should kill the women and also young boys too. Now, is this a command that is added to what God has already commanded? And there are a number of scholars who say this seems to be kind of Moses' reaction because, of course, he's angered by the women who were involved. But again, the initial command that God gave was to kill the men. It had nothing to do with the women. So there was culpability, but again, so we do see a number of biblical scholars who say, well, this actually, maybe Moses kind of adding on his own perspective that actually wasn't commanded by God. We also don't see anyone taking any action on this either. But again, even if this is literally true, if this indeed did happen, we go to Judges chapter 6 and we see the Midianites, a fairly short time after, engaging in raids against the Israelites. And then it says that these Midianites were too numerous to count, including their camels. Now, how do they get from apparently a total obliteration to being able to have camels, people to ride them, that were innumerable, more than the sands of the seashore. They're just innumerable amounts of soldiers here. Well, if you see this as taking place in a kind of like this war text sort of phenomenon, then you're not surprised to see this very thing taking place. Let me say something about, we can come back to this during the Q&A time if you like, but let me just move on to the Amalekites. Now we see that that Israel is attacked and plundered by the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 14:48. This is often lost on people who interpret the passage in 1 Samuel 15 where God says, utterly destroy the Amalekites. Well, what preceded that? In chapter 14 it says that the Amalekites had plundered the Israelites. So it's not as though it's just coming out of the blue, and of course the Amalekites had it in for the Israelites from the very beginning. So there had been animosity. Now, of course, God is willing to forgive, and if the Amalekites had abandoned their ways, God, does operate in this manner of forgiving. In fact, he says in Jeremiah 18 that if a nation, any nation, not just Israel, but if a nation turns from its wickedness, repents, and turns to the Lord, it says that God will have mercy. He will relent from the judgment that he had promised. That's just how God operates. So this sort of an offer would be open to Amalekites or Assyrians, Ninevites, and so forth. This is how God operated. But again, the Amalekites are constantly at the throat of the Israelites. In fact, we even see that in Esther's reign, when Esther is in Persia, there is Haman, the Agagite. Agag was a king of the Amalekites, mentioned in 1 Samuel 15. So for about 1,000 years, these Amalekites are are seeking the destruction of the Israelites. But let me move on here. So we see the Amalekites instigating trouble. So their king, we're told in 1 Samuel 15, is ruthless. He's been had the pattern of making women childless. So Saul is commanded to utterly destroy everything. It says women, children, young and old, and so forth, animals. Well, how literally should we take this? Well, for one thing, though women and children are mentioned, we just see a pitched battle in verse 5 of 1 Samuel 15, where Saul fights in the city of Amalek. Now, on a literal reading, we see that Saul carried this out. In fact, Saul warns the Canaanites who are in this city, where the battle is about to take place. He says, you've been friends to us. We have no issue with you. Why don't you leave? And because our battle is with the Amalekites. And so they do leave. And so Saul engages in a battle with the Amalekites. It doesn't sound like you're going to have a lot of civilians hanging around here, a lot of non-combatants. But what we do have is we have the mention of the narrator that Saul utterly destroyed all the people. Again, we have this sort of a warfare text, this hyperbole that we'll explore in just a minute. And then we read later on that Saul told Samuel himself this very thing, that he had utterly destroyed the Amalekites. The rest of the conversation now has to do with the animals that were presumably part of the city where the battle took place, and that Saul had kept them alive. And of course, Saul was rationalizing all of this away. But the utter destruction, if we see that King Agag, who was killed by by Samuel, takes place. If we take this literally, then we'd say, well, all the Amalekites are finished off. They're done for. That's it. End of story. But in the very same book, in 1 Samuel 27, and then in 1 Samuel 30, we see that there's another army that now David is fighting in the same territory. Again, this vast tract of land where he's kind of chasing them. And 400 of these escape. Now, there's a lot of exaggeration that takes place. In fact, even the very numbers, that Saul, it mentions that Saul has 210,000 soldiers. Well, this would have been more massive than the actual numbers that we know of Egypt or Assyria. That they had, again, that they had more like 150 or 200,000 soldiers at their peak in the ancient Near East. And again, Saul no way would have had this much. And again, numbers are tricky. They're often exaggerated in these war texts. Or there may be another way of reading these numbers, as some scholars say. But again, I don't want to get into that. But the point is that there is a lot of hyperbole that seems to be bound up with these war texts. Now, to illustrate this, and we're winding down here, but let me just say, God even commands the Israelites, God says about Judah, when they are in the beginning of midway through Jeremiah, it says in Jeremiah 25:9 that God promises that he will utterly destroy Judah. And we read to the end of the book, and what happens? Well, we actually see that Judah has not been utterly destroyed. Judah is still, it's been disabled militarily, politically, economically, religiously, and so forth, sure. But most of the people remain behind in the land. And we also see the urban elite from Jerusalem, many of them being shipped off to Babylon. So we have a people that are, yes, there's a lot of killing, but many of them survive. And again, it maintains a certain identity during this Babylonian captivity. But surely nothing reaching this literal, utter destruction that God promises. So we see the language used not just of the Canaanites, but also of the people of Judah. And again, this sort of a thing does not happen. Now we read also that Joshua, especially chapter 11 in Joshua, the book of Joshua, where it says that Joshua destroyed, or he carried out all that Moses commanded. So Moses commanded in Deuteronomy 20 to utterly destroy them and so forth. Well, we read in Joshua that they were not all utterly destroyed. So if Joshua is carrying out the commands of Moses to utterly destroy them, and they are not utterly destroyed, then maybe what Moses has in mind is part of this ancient Near Eastern hyperbole or exaggeration. That it is not literally meant to be the case, but to have this effect of incapacitation, to have this capacity of disabling. So this is the sort of thing that we see repeatedly as we look at these ancient Near Eastern texts. So no, God did not command genocide. Total disappearance was not the goal, but is to drive them out, and any that remained behind left themselves in harm's way. So despite the obvious signs of God's presence, those who were resistant and wanted to persist in trying to fight against this God who trumps the Egyptian gods and who makes himself known in the presence of the Israelite camp in various obvious ways, then they leave themselves in harm's way. So God may command killing in unique, supreme emergency type situations for an overriding good. So this is the sort of thing that I wanted to talk about, and we'll pick up on the question and answer time later on. But now it's time to call this to a close, and we'll turn it over to Jeffrey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That certainly raises some interesting issues and questions, which we'll address, of course, in our Q&A. Let's take a 15-minute break, and which means we'll... Bill, what is do we reconvene at 10:45 or 10:50? Okay, so that's 15 minutes. So help yourself to the coffee and snacks. They're right down the hall here. Otherwise, please don't wander too far.